If you're asking how to draw with pastel pencils, you're really asking two questions: how to draw and how to use your medium. Mastering both is key to creating realistic art. Before we get into using your medium, let's talk about drawing fundamentals, the principles that underpin all realistic art, no matter the medium. These are ideas like values, colour, edges and perspective. While they might sound familiar, bringing them all together takes time and their real power becomes clear only with practice. First, there's value, which is all about light and dark. Think of it as a scale that runs from black to white, although value isn't restricted to just white, grey and black. It is easy to confuse value and colour because while they're different, we often describe a colour using its value, such as this is a dark blue. Mastering values before colour can add an incredible sense of depth and realism to your art because it shows us something is 3D. It's why even black and white photographs still look three-dimensional. They're built on values alone, without relying on colour at all. Colour is another complex area, and we can describe a colour using lots of different attributes like saturation, hue, vibrancy, opacity, and of course value. You don't need to learn all of that right away. Instead, let's take a look at this colour wheel. Firstly, each colour family, which is something like yellow, blue or red, is known as a hue. Inside a hue, you'll get variations of that colour, like a bluey green or a yellow green. Saturation is also important and tells us how pure that colour is. When we mix a different colour, or white or black, with the pigment, we desaturate it. At a certain point, it will look muddy or grey, and these can be called neutralised colours or chromatic greys. It's fancy talk for a weaker colour. This can be useful to remember because too many highly saturated colours on one page will be very distracting, so we can use these neutralised colours or greys to provide balance. Complementary colours that you might have heard of are opposite to each other on the colour wheel, and these create contrast and naturally draw attention to certain areas. Meanwhile, harmonious colours like yellow, orange and red sit side by side on the wheel, creating a calming effect that lets parts of the artwork blend together more subtly. Another method for drawing attention to areas of your artwork is through edges. Hard edges bring contrast and make features stand out, while soft or lost edges allow areas to blend into the background. For realism, elements closest to the viewer benefit from sharper edges in general, while those further back or less significant can be softened out. Controlling these shifts in your edges builds depth, directs the viewer's gaze, and is part of composition. Finally, there's perspective, which brings values and edges together to create the illusion of space. Even in a close-up pet portrait, perspective is essential for capturing the form and solidity of your subject. For example, when I draw a dog, I prefer the 3/4 angle, which avoids any awkwardly foreshortened snouts and instead brings the animal's natural proportions out. When these fundamentals work together, they build the framework of a realistic image. So, with that foundation set, let's dive into how we bring all of this to life in pastels, starting with your material choices. For my paper, I tend to use pastel matte because it gives me great control over both soft and sharp markings, allowing me to confidently build depth with varied edges. This paper also holds a significant amount of pastel, letting me build up values and colours through multiple layers. This is much like building a painting in oils or acrylics, where you let each layer dry before adding more. An alternative to pastel matte is Canson Mi-Tientes velvet paper. At the time of recording, this paper is new to the market, but it has a wonderful surface. However, it's a bit more expensive. For a different effect, I sometimes work on velour paper, which naturally creates softer edges, giving a drawing a gentle, soft focus. I find that too many hard edges can often disrupt the feel of a representational drawing, so velour can be helpful in achieving a smoother look with less effort. While you can still create sharp edges on velour, it does require intention, similar to painting with oils, where the colours will naturally blend if you're not careful. Just as important as the paper are of course the pastels themselves. Different brands behave much like brushes in painting. Some are like bristle brushes, which create stronger markings, while others, like sable brushes, lay down pigment more softly. Faber-Castell, for example, is a harder pencil. It's ideal for sharp details as well as underpaintings on pastel mat. It doesn't work well on velour paper because the pencil needs more grip for the pigment to show up effectively. This pencil's firmness lets you create fine, crisp details, though it can struggle to show up over too much pastel. For a softer option, I like Stabilo pencils. They're versatile on both pastel mat and velour, suitable for both underpaintings and details. Because they are softer, Stabilo shows up over thicker layers of pastel better than Faber-Castell. However, the marks might not be quite as sharp. For beginners, Faber-Castell might feel more familiar due to its firmness, and this is more like a traditional pencil, while Stabilo offers softer marks like charcoal and more layering options, as well as compatibility with velour. There are also pastel chalks, which are thick and highly pigmented. These will usually be much more vibrant than your pencils because there's a lot more colour in them. These can be good for the first stage of a painting, known as an underpainting, to cover an area quickly. These will lay down a thicker layer than a pencil, so I use a hard pastel chalk if I'm working on top with the Faber-Castell pencils. Most stick pastels in shops are soft pastels, and you'll just want to be a little bit more careful with these because if you have a lot of details to add, it might be difficult for them to show up if the layers are too thick. You've also got the option of pan pastels for covering big areas. These may seem expensive, but they last and last. The process is like painting to apply them, and again, they're good for that first layer and can provide more pigment and vibrancy than a pencil. In addition to pencils and paper, you'll also want to have blending tools on hand. I often use soft tools from Pan Pastel to blend large areas with care. A light touch is key here. If you press too hard, you'll wear down the tool very quickly. Fingers can work too, as long as they're clean, or even makeup blenders. To keep my pencils sharp, I use a Stanley knife with P120 sanding paper, which creates a long, pointed nib and it's perfect for detailed work, but it also exposes enough pastel to use it on the side and cover large areas for an underpainting. This sharpening method also prevents the pastel from breaking, which can happen with regular sharpeners more often. Finally, glassine paper is essential for protecting your work from accidental smudges, and it can be laid over finished drawings to keep them safe before framing. With the right combination of materials, you can fully take advantage of the pastel medium by applying the fundamentals we've covered in a way that best suits your style and your subject. Now that you know what materials are out there, let's see how to use them to create realistic art. These techniques are useful across different mediums, not just pastel pencils. While the process might vary a bit, the principles remain the same. Blending is a great place to start. As you might guess, blending can be straightforward or a bit challenging depending on the paper and the pencils that you've chosen. Velour paper makes blending really easy. But Faber-Castell on pastel mat can be a little bit trickier, so let's take a look at that. One method for blending is to apply your pastel generously and create a slight excess on the page. But keep in mind that managing the layer thickness is crucial to ensure that your details can still show up clearly over the blended areas. This is why practicing pencil control is so valuable, aiming to create layers that gradually merge. I like to use the pencil itself as a blending tool, lifting it on and off the page to encourage a softer edge that fades into the next colour. Working back and forth between pencils, shading gently, will help them blend smoothly together. Some colours have a weaker tinting strength, meaning they fade more easily, so it's helpful to experiment with these qualities. For example, Faber-Castell's 157 is a highly pigmented pencil, so it's going to overpower others. When it comes to blending, I will often use the other colour to blend into the 157 to prevent it from being overmixed with too much of the 157. When blending fine details like fur, you might need to adjust the edges to support the 3D illusion of realism. For this, try softly tapping with a clean finger. This technique blends, but it doesn't smudge, so it retains some detail but softens your edges. Speaking of details, creating textures like fur or feathers is very common in pastel pencil work. A sharp point is ideal here, but the technique and the motion matter just as much. Practicing this with a regular pencil on copy paper is actually a really good place to start. It's easier to control and it lets you master the motions with a familiar and cheaper tool. I've also created a free ebook with exercises that will help you refine these textures. You can download it below. But here's a rundown of common mistakes. Firstly, pressing too hard will give you thick, rigid marks. Secondly, drawing in patterns or rows. I see this a lot and it can happen almost subconsciously, so try moving your wrist around to keep things looking natural. Avoid perfectly straight hairs too. Instead, work on achieving a consistent, gentle curve. And lastly, remember the flow. While there shouldn't be a pattern or sets of rows, the hairs will need a direction. For example, take a look at this Atlas of Animal Anatomy and you see that the canines have a specific direction for their fur all over the body. These techniques do take time to master, so start on your inexpensive copy paper with a regular pencil. It is also useful to test your material's limits when you move on to pastels. So I'd make swatches of pastel, like mock underpaintings, and then try drawing fur over the top of them. Intentionally make these mock underpaintings too thick and too thin to learn what works and what doesn't. Keep these test pieces as reference points. They'll often reveal solutions or remind you of a pitfall to avoid in future drawings. Removing material obstacles and building familiarity with these techniques will ultimately help you focus more fully on the fundamentals, taking your realism to a new level. Now I'll show you how we can tie all of this together with a free tutorial. So the first task is to get an idea of the materials that you're using and which ones you might want to be picking out. So if you're not familiar with your materials, I would start by doing some swatches on whichever paper that you've chosen with whichever pencils that you have to hand. So because I've got such a dark page, this is the black from Canson Mi-Tientes Velvet range, not all of these pencils are actually covering the tooth of the card particularly well. And particularly this yellow feels quite weak. We have some of the tooth of the card showing through. That's an opportunity for using some pastel chalks instead. So the pastel chalks are much thicker and they're going to fill the tooth of the card more completely. This here is a pretty affordable soft pastel from Arrtx, and I did actually do a review of these. They are, as I say, very affordable. They're not a particularly high quality pastel chalk, but look how much more vibrant they are on the page because your pastel blocks have more pigment in them, and being softer than a pencil, they're able to fill in the tooth of the card quite a lot more easily as well. So when you do have particularly vivid subjects like this fish, that is when you would want to consider turning to a pastel chalk for your underpainting, because they're going to show up on the page for you a lot better, even if they are a fairly cheap brand, which this one is. So you can see these give me a much better range for my underpainting than the Stabilo Crabothello pencils, which now by comparison feel almost dull. So what I'm going to do now is a sketch and plan out this drawing. Now I am working on actual pastel paper at this point, which obviously if you're a beginner would be deemed a little bit of a waste, and I totally get that, but you don't need to do this in pastels. You can do this with an ordinary pencil, and it's just a case of mapping out where your lights and your darks are. So I've obviously got a nice big light patch running along the top of the belly. As I said, this is just a case of figuring out where your lightest lights might want to go. So you can do this on a piece of paper with an ordinary pencil. You can also, if you've got a program like Photoshop, just use the cutout filter on that to help you. You don't want to be aiming for something that has too many different values in it. You want to be aiming for something that makes it feel fairly general, and this is like the prep for your underpainting. And then from there, we would be able to add the details, the nuances in the colours and the values. All right, so here is a really odd looking fish. I almost describe it like a jigsaw at this stage. This isn't anything to do with the final piece. I'm doing this to kind of show you mentally how I look at an image and how I start to process it as different areas of light and dark. Obviously, the colours are not correct at all. Already, I know I'm going to have some issues getting a dark and vibrant red. I don't have it in the Stabilo, so I will have to be going into the sort of purpley sections, reddy purples, mauves, that will take my value dark enough. But of course, thinking about our colour theory, the purples and the reds sit next to each other on the colour wheel. So they're harmonious. As I get darker into the reds, I can slip into the purple section of that colour, of that hue family. I can head over towards the next hue next door. The nice thing as well about that is as I get lighter, I'm going from red into orange into yellow, so working our way around the colour wheel, and we get towards the yellows or orange yellows for the lighter areas. So we're in a red purple for the darks and an orange yellow for the lights, and these are they're almost complementary. A yellow and a purple is complementary. So that's adding extra contrast to our lights and our darks. You don't just have to contrast a light and a dark by the value, by how light or dark it is. You can also contrast it with lots of other things like textures. One area could be detailed, the other area could lack detail. In this case, we've also got the offset of the complementary colours as well, which is going to make it a bit more interesting. But obviously, it's a choice I have to make because I actually don't have the correct colours without going and getting lots more art supplies, which I would love to do, to be honest, but we're not going to do that today. Okay, so when you get to the point where you're happy enough with your outline, and obviously you don't need to draw this freehand if you don't want to. You can just trace something, you could print it out as well. Printing out obviously just means that all you would do is have your image and then carry on from that step as I'm about to get it onto your paper. So however you're getting your image onto the paper, I need to stop fiddling with that. Follow these steps, and it really is quite simple. So take your drawing and flip it onto the reverse side. Now you can do this with a pencil. Because I have them to hand, I'm just going to use a block because it is a lot quicker, but I do actually do this with a pencil a lot of the time. And simply fill the back of the page with a good layer. So you can see why it's faster to do that with a block than a pencil. Equally, if you've got dust left over from your pencil sharpenings, this is a really good use for it. Make sure to tap or blow any excess away. Just giving my hands a quick wipe because obviously you've got quite a bit of pastel dust on your fingers doing that. Then simply flip it the right way and place it where you'd like your drawing to be on the page. Now you can use a bit of low tack tape to hold this in place if you would like. I usually opt for a biro pen to do the outline with. The reason being it gives me a nice firm outline. I don't have to press too hard, but I know that I will get a really sharp line from this pen. You don't want to press too hard because if you do, you'll end up with a lot of indentations in the page. It also means that on this side, you can see where you've been nice and easily already. It stands out for you. So I would recommend a biro over using a pencil. So I'm going to get started with my pastel chalks. This is S167 from Arrtx, but it's just a nice punchy orange really. So you can see it does fill in the tooth of the card quite nicely. I'm not pressing too hard because of course this is a chalk, and if I do end up pressing too hard there won't be enough space in the tooth of the card to continue working later. So I'm looking between the reference photo and the little sketch that I did just before starting. So this is when you're thinking about the placement of your values. Where are the lights and the darks going? And getting lighter with the 153. So you could be using any colours for this, but it's about how light and dark the areas are. You could make your fish blue if you wanted to, and it would still work provided that you follow the correct arrangement of values. So I'm now going to start blocking in the darks with the 330, which, as I've said, is quite a purple colour. The reason I've picked it is because I haven't got a red that is a dark enough value in the Stabilo Crabothello set. Now, it's worth mentioning here that if I was to be using a different value paper, different colour of paper as well, the pencils would behave quite differently, and I might not need to rely on other pastels to fill in some gaps for me. Choosing a different colour of pastel paper really does change the way that your material looks. It's the same as if you're painting in oils and you change the colour of the canvas to begin with. You'll notice that some artists have a specific colour that they start with every time, and it really affects the way that the other layers end up looking. Quite a lot of artists enjoy working on a red canvas, or red ground it can be called, and this can really make certain colours pop, and it can give an overall warmth to the piece as well. So here is a really good example of edge management. If we look at the photograph, it is really, really soft and the details start to become out of focus over there. And that's partly because this is the foreground, the face is the main feature, and as we get further away, we can't see as many details, but also if we were to put details everywhere, it would be really distracting to look at. So we get a really nice contrast here between the yellow on the belly that's catching a lot of light, and then the dark, and I've made purple area of the tail just behind. This is number 305, starting to work into the red areas of the face. So this stage I'm focused on getting the page filled as opposed to starting to nuance everything too much or join things together too much at this stage. This is the 221, which is the darkest sort of orange yellow that they offer. This one does struggle to fill in the tooth of the card. The pigment is just a bit weak for the black paper. So let's get some of the greys in, and then once the greys are in, most of the card is going to be filled. I've realised I've just forgotten that whole space down there. I often find that I'm working on a piece and then just don't notice that I've left an entire section not filled in. So my darkest grey is the 726, followed then by the 724, and lastly the 722. Just going to be careful how much of this tail I fill in, because a lot of it I'm going to leave fairly loose over there anyway. So if I start to fill it in too much, I will just end up smudging something that I might want to actually leave as the finished result, which wouldn't be very good. Okay, so that is our underpainting in. You can see it's a slightly more refined version of what we did earlier. I've used a wider variety of materials to get me a wider variety of values and colours in there as well. I'm obviously still quite restricted by the medium and the fact that I'm working with one set on this very dark paper, but I think it's a really good opportunity to show you the effects you can get by using your colour theory, relying on massing your values together and your edge management to still create a piece that looks really good and interesting by the end, even if it's not exactly what your photograph is. And I think that is something that people really struggle with, is to see how to problem solve your way around maybe gaps in colours or values. And as a beginner especially, that is really tricky to start to understand. So moving into the second stage, the first stage was laying in your general values and general colours as well. It's allowed to look very messy and you don't need to worry too much about your edge management at this stage. The second stage is when we start to model our edges, and that is thinking about whether they are hard or whether they are soft, and when we will start to add more intermediate values and colours or details into the rest of the piece. I call this the modelling out stage, and to be honest, it can go as far as you want in terms of heading towards a finished piece. At some stage you start to accept that you're now working on the final layer of details. But to begin with, we need to start to knit all of this together, and that is going to require including more colours and values and of course blending. So I'm going to start on the face at the front. Usually the face is your focal point, so usually you'll have the most found or hard edges on the face. And even if the photo is slightly out of focus, you probably want to make that the area of highest detail and focus for your whole drawing. It's a general rule, but it's a pretty good rule to have. So we need to start with the eyes, which I haven't touched yet, just because they're quite small and the first stage of the painting was fairly messy. I'm going to use the 685 from Stabilo to start to add the gold into the eyes. This can obviously be changed and updated as needed. You can actually see it's very orange at the top there, like a reddish orange, but I quite like the idea of putting some gold into the eyes, to be honest. So I'm just dabbing this round to start with, and then we're going to cut into it. So we can't really see any gold on the other side, maybe the tiniest bit at the top. It's this side that's catching the most light. I've also got some really dark browns in there. So the 635 is pretty dark. In fact, it almost doesn't show up against the black too well at this stage, so that is a really good bet. And I'm just going to start to cut into some of the gold that I've put down. You can see on the photograph we have the dark, particularly on the left-hand side of the eye. So I'm glazing over some of that gold. By glazing over it, it prevents it feeling too flat. I'm not pressing too hard with the pencil for all of this. I'm allowing some of this to blend together. We're starting to think about our edges. Picking up my gold again. And then lastly the black, although arguably it isn't really needed, the 750. And I'm going to add that into the left-hand eye, which is going to be left fairly simple. Then pick up my light grey that I was using earlier, the 722, to add the nice little reflection that we have at the bottom. So I would encourage you to think about working around the space, but because the eye is already in, I naturally want to start modelling this area out first and then kind of grow it. But it is a case of what works for you and how you're most comfortable drawing. I'm going to start with the 221, which is their nice orangey yellow, and I'm just going to be shading gently now over the top and mixing this into the colours that are already there to make the value lighter and make the colour closer to the orange, as you can see. So small circles work well for blending things. So thinking about our edges, these are really soft. We're not adding details and we're not adding a new section. This is changes of light over an area of the scales or the skin. And because of that, a lot of this is really soft. If you make too many hard edges, it's going to look like everything's been stuck on instead. So start to knit these areas of the underpainting together as well. Blunt pencils do work best for this because I'm just gently joining things into one another. That's why I've not stopped to bother sharpening things up. Remember that you can glaze backwards and forwards, so it's another way to make that layer that we've just put down meld into everything that was already there. Again, just keep in mind that some pencils aren't going to show up as easily over the top of other layers, so your yellows and oranges are going to be weaker in general than the reds, so you probably want to be a little bit more careful when you're blending back over the top with a red, because it will get rid of a lot of the orange and the yellow quite easily. Working further down the face, I'm picking up my dark grey again, and if you look at the photo, all of this is really softly blended together. I think working with this pencil right now, I can tell it's going to take me a little bit of work to get these to gently blend together. I think I might just go a step darker and pick out my Payne's grey. And this is a really purple grey. So projects like fish or beetles or butterflies, anything that's fairly smooth without fur over the top, they're really good projects if you're a beginner to get started. You can get some lovely results with them, but it gives you a lot of opportunity to practice underpaintings and blending, which ultimately is going to support any fur work that you put over the top. And fur in general is the thing that people struggle with the most, just because of the dexterity for getting the markings correct. So it's good to start with something that's a little bit easier and allows you to build up those core skills before adding details like fur over the top of them. So super, super soft, all of this. Let's pop the little mouth in. Now, the mouth, although is black, it's not actually got a hard edge. It's actually very, very soft. So I'll pop the little open mouth in, go around with the red just to make the tonal, the value there, transition a little bit more stark and give us a slightly sharper edge on the top so that we can see it a little bit more easily. And then gently re-establish the red around this area over the top of all that underpainting work that I've been doing. I want this to be really, really soft down here. And then I can just pick up the purple again and just blend out the lower half of the mouth, which is the particularly soft bit. So the mouth is there, but it's not distracting us too much. It's the eye that we're looking at. So I've just blended all of that section together, which of course has made the edges incredibly soft there, and it means that it's not distracting us. While it's still supporting what's happening in the rest of the drawing, it's not drawing our attention to that specific area. And I'm going to continue using the 310 as a blending tool. I'm using it in small circles just to start to join everything over here together. And it's also making the underpainting just a little bit more red-orange. I'm going to bring out a neutral now, the 620. This is much more of a golden brown. So remember what I said, neutrals provide areas for our eyes to rest and help to balance bright colours. At the minute, we've got very saturated colours on the page, which is really nice and exciting, but we are going to need some slightly less saturated areas so that this doesn't feel too false, but also to give it some cohesion and balance. So this is a nice golden brown. In fact, Stabilo do some really lovely golden browns. I'm going to glaze over this purple. Purple's helping to make this feel darker, but this is the 670. It's a red-brown, and so it's reducing the saturation. So what that is doing for this section here is allowing this to recede because it is less saturated than these areas. So this is another feature of colours. Not all colours come forward, some colours recede, and often if they are desaturated, they're going to sit in the background more easily and more quietly. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use anything bright in your background. It could be a compositional tool to draw the eye, for example, or maybe in fact your detail or your focus area is further away and the foreground is blurred out. But as a general rule, if you're struggling with areas of your painting jumping forwards towards you, such as this area here, which of course was the exact same colour as this section, then you can desaturate it or make it darker and it starts to head further back. So that is a nice glaze over the top. I've got a lovely mix between this pencil, which is too much of a red-brown, and the purple beneath it. So I'm going to do the same over the purple back here. Now, another nice thing about using the colours that I did at the start in such a general way and putting purple all over for the darks and then all of those oranges is that it will add harmony to your finished work. Even though I didn't want to leave this as the purple that was down, by using it for all of the darks, it's giving them a similarity and it's allowing everything to sit on the page with a nice cohesion. So working with a smaller selection of pencils, especially at the start of your drawing, can really help tie everything together, especially if you then just glaze into them and create mixes. So look how soft and general I'm getting at the back. We can't really tell what's going on in this section, which is exactly what I want to happen. We want a lack of details. Okay, so I'm going to start to do the same thing for the fin down here, which is not as apparent straight away. It's not catching that much light until this section. So this bit towards the bottom needs soft edges because it needs to sit there very quietly and not distract us. So keep everything quite similar, keep the values close, and don't create too many differences in the colours. In effect, simplify it. So we started to pull everything together really quite nicely now, compared to what it looked like 10, 15, 20 minutes ago when it was all broken up. Much more similar to this, we now have a fish sat on the page, and a lot of that really is to do with your edge management and drawing all of those areas together by glazing, by blending, and also by adding more intermediate values to help step us from one area into the next. So as a beginner, that stage should take you quite a long time to complete, and you should really be thinking actively about whether you need soft edges or a hard edge or something in the middle as you go along instead of guessing. So we're going to start to add a little bit of blue into the fins. Now we can see a little bit of blue in the photograph, probably mostly because of the edit, but I personally really like that touch because the blue is a complementary colour to the orange, and therefore we get a higher contrast, which again is just making this image more alluring to look at and so much more eye-catching. So I am using the 430 from Stabilo. Another pencil that caught my eye and I might weave in and out as well is the 435, which is just brighter and a bit cooler. It's a little bit further around towards green on the colour wheel, and you can see that this shows up over the top of the first blue pencil a little bit brighter and adds a little bit more zest and zing without becoming too blue. And a lot of that is because of the black paper that we're using. It means that these colours aren't showing up quite as bright as they might normally, but in this instance that's quite useful. So I'm just looking for where I can really see the silvery fin catching the light and becoming far more blue. You can see I'm lifting the pencil on and off the page as I do this, so it's a good practice for your fur technique. Starting to pick out some of the softer details here and there. This lovely area of really velvety light on top of the head. And you can add these in with strong markings by pressing hard and then gently push the pencil around to get that soft velvety texture. So I'd argue now we're at the detail stage, and this is where we just start to increase the contrast between our values a bit more and start to add on the textures that we can see. And in this case, to be honest, there aren't that many textures to add, particularly on the body, but we obviously have these lovely flowing fins, and a lot of that is just to do with getting your pencil direction, as I already have here, flowing. And if you manage to do that, then you start to get that beautiful, soft, billowy effect, and that is exactly the same as doing fur. If you had fur markings that were cross-hatching, then you're not going to get a very good effect by the end, but if you follow the flow, then you're going to get a really nice finish. So I think the lighting over the fish is starting to look really good. We need to do quite a bit more work on the tail, and particularly with some of these edges back here. So I've just picked up the 655 to start to make this section a little bit darker and less saturated, which just means that we have less pure colour in there. So we're muddying those colours. Remember, that can also be referred to as a neutralised colour as well. And they provide good balance when you've got a lot of saturated bright colours in your work. So greys and browns, as much as we might think of them initially as boring colours, are incredibly useful. So we've got some sort of golden browns over here. I'm going to put a little bit of this down first before picking out another colour. So it's all starting to feel softer, which is what we need. Also just going to soften up this edge up here. It has become a little bit hard, so I'm just taking one of the oranges, just really, really gently glazing over the top. We do need to make this lighter as well, that will be happening. And returning to the tail, I have the 620. I'm just gently starting to pick out some more details, getting a little bit lighter, changing the colour family, which of course is called the hue. And this is creating a bit of contrast and some more variation, which makes it feel more dynamic and a little bit more 3D and realistic. Down here I am using a very, very pale pink, the 681. I would like a bit more pigment in this, to be perfectly honest, to be coming through. I'd like a bit more of a baby pink, but the pencil just isn't delivering it over all of these layers and the dark card. And of course, you know, the Stabilo pencils are quite an affordable range, so they're not going to have necessarily quite as much pigment in them as some of the other brands might have. So you've just got to bear that in mind, that if you are buying cheaper materials, in general, the limitation that you will encounter, as a very general rule, is that there will be less pigment. And sometimes it won't matter too much because you're going over a certain colour with it and it shows up well. But sometimes, as in this situation, I can't really tell that I'm going in with a pink in particular. It's almost like a light grey that I'm heading in there with, whereas a pink would have worked really well because it would have contrasted the colours already down there as well. But it's not available, so that's that. So I'm working on the edge of the tail now, and I want to leave this a little bit open so that we get a soft billowy finish. If I give this a perfect edge, it could have the effect of making it feel kind of solid, which isn't what I want, but I also want a soft edge there because, again, the main focus is here on the face, not back there, although the tail is beautiful and therefore is going to get, of course, some attention. If we make this edge between the tail and the black a little bit too sharp, it's just going to feel very awkward on the page and definitely compete against the face for the viewer's attention or the viewer's initial attention. So I do quite like to keep aspects like a flowing tail or wings in motion fairly fluid and not completely finished, you could argue, on the page. So that is a bit of a stylistic choice, but again, it's just another manipulation of your edges. That's all it is. I'm just breaking up the edges a little bit, adding some deeper tones without going all the way to black. The lovely blue, the 400, it's a very nice, rich, deep blue. Now, I'm not actually pressing too hard with this pencil. It's going over the top of some fairly delicate colours and some quite light values as well. So you've got to be a little bit careful not to over muddy that. Want to add a little bit more light. This is what I was trying to do with the pink pencil, but it was just not showing up. Again, just very, very softly with my finger. There's quite a lot of pastel down. It all blends together really easily at this stage. Get that light in there. I'm just going to use this to add a little bit of light over the body, almost like detail, because I'm going to break up the mark so it creates some textures, and then I will nuance the edges so that it doesn't look too distracting. Then just gently, very, very gently, especially when I'm working from the blue into the orange, you're picking up the complementary colour there. So you want to be very careful about keeping your finger nice and clean. For these bits, I'm literally tapping up and down, and that it helps the pastel to almost adhere to that section, but it doesn't blend it in as much. Obviously, you could use a soft tool for this. Just going in and bringing out a few values on the face, making them lighter so that the attention is brought back to the face, because I have made that quite bright at the back. It's taking off quite a lot of attention, but I do quite like the way it looks. So I just need to go back and balance up the face as much as I can. So for the edge of the tail, I quite like to use a putty rubber for these areas, just to go along and make it a little bit softer and smokier. It is up to you. On the Canson Mi-Tientes velvet paper, it doesn't smudge quite as much, so this has a slightly different effect to how it would on the pastel mat, which is a little bit of a softer surface, something I thought I'd never say. This pastel mat, until this stuff came out, had the most grip. It was the surface with the most grip, but actually I think the Canson Mi-Tientes does have a better surface, dare I say it, for technical drawing at the very least. So there you have it. It's a combination of values, it's a combination of colour relationships, of edge management and perspective to create the illusion of depth and realism on the page. It doesn't come overnight, and it never will, but with dedicated conscious practice, thinking about your fundamentals as well as your materials, you will start to see significant improvements in your work. If you want to find out more and access detailed courses, then do just head over to the membership, which is linked down below, along with the free ebook on how to get started with drawing fur.